say 85% of 14.5 billion neurons fires simultaneously, that creates enough of a difference in the electromagnetic field around the scalp that you can pick it up on a machine. Therefore, you can put electrodes on the brain, and you can then pick up on an oscilloscope a general biphasic wave, 14, 15 per second when you're awake. When you have a seizure, all hell breaks loose visually on the oscilloscope. It just goes all over the place. And it has been found that by taking careful EEGs, electroencephalograms, electro means electricity, encephalo means head, and gram means writing, or graph is the machine that does the writing. If you, with using an EEG, it is possible to find out where the seizure originates. In other words, there seems to be one part of the brain where the firing gets all out of whack, and then it just sends impulses through other parts of the brain, and when this normal pattern of firing is destroyed, the person goes into a convulsion, a fit, and flops out and shakes and quivers and so on. They found out experimentally that if they could find the part of the brain where that started and then ablate it, destroy it, and if it was in a part of the brain like here or somewhere else where we know that if you ablate, nothing really tragic seems to happen, that they could get rid of epilepsy in the person's life. Well, it so happened that a couple of people came in almost at the same time where the site of origin of the epileptic seizure was on the bilateral mesial temporal lobe. Now, I'll tell you where that is. This is looking at the brain from the side. This part is the temporal lobe. As you know, the brain is put in two halves. And here's the guy's nose, and here's his eyes. And the temporal lobe comes forward like this. There is an area right here. Bi means two, lateral means sides, mesial means on inside, and this is the temporal lobe. So the bilateral mesial temporal lobe is an area where that seems to be critical to the transmission of short-term memory into long-term memory. These two people, one was a pianist and one was an engineering draftsman, came in about the same time, and they calculated the location of the seizure, or origin of the seizure, and they ablated these areas. They stick an electrode and just burn it out. And they got rid of the epilepsy, but they destroyed the ability of the person ever to get anything into long-term storage. Now, short-term storage lasts only a few seconds, 4 to 5 seconds. And the big research in memory centers now around trying to find out what it is that makes something go from short-term memory into long-term memory. And we know some of those things. I'm going to give you a list of them by the time we end this seminar, so you'll know what they are. Now, this pianist who had this happen to him, of course, couldn't even remember what it was that happened to him to make him not be able to remember anything. He remembers going to have an operation, but after the operation, anything that happens to him could never be remembered, except just for 4 or 5 seconds while it's happening to him. They found that which meant, of course, he could not learn any new music. Now, everything that he memorized before the operation, he still had. And so he still tried to give concerts, but they were terribly distressing experiences for him, because after he played the first piece on the program, and the applause was over, he couldn't remember that he played it. And therefore he would look at the program and play the same piece again. So his manager would say, we're going to start the program now with the second piece. And he'd say, but what will the audience think? They'll think I've lost my mind. I better start right where the program is. They'd say, no, just play the second one. Because if they would say to him, you've already played the first one, he would deny it. So it was just too much of a stress. He got a book for Christmas. He would start the book in the morning, and he would read. And the minute he would stop reading and get a cup of coffee, and he'd come back and he'd see the book, it looked like a brand new book, he'd start at the beginning again. She said I talked with Brenda Miller. She came to Indiana State for a seminar on brain mechanisms and memory. And she told me that he just carried this book around. And although he thought it was a new book each time, as he carried it around, it got more tattered and worn, and therefore it began to look like an old book. But to him, it was a new book. And so he only kept reading the first 10, 15, 20, 30 pages, depending on how long he had to read, because the minute he stopped, and 5 or 6 seconds would lapse, it would be a new book. Now, when he would go to the theater to see a play, the minute he could follow the train of thought, and it would all make sense, but the minute the intermission was over, he would come back in, and he always wondered, why in the world are they starting with the second act? Especially if he knew the play. So if he knew the Shakespeare play, he'd say, oh no, they're starting with the second act, it's a terrible mistake, and he'd get terribly agitated. Well, you can imagine how not being able to have any... You see, this man could only live in the immediate present and in the very remote past, because as he got older and older and older, there would just be, well, this is now 8 years, 10 years ago, he simply has a 10-year gap of which there is no recollection whatever, and his memory long-term begins and in 1963. That's when he had the operation, so it was about 1963. So that's just a dead total loss. And he looks older in the mirror, but his memory of himself really starts 10 years ago, 12 years ago. Now the draftsman could be given a small task, but the minute he had the task interrupted and he came back to it, he couldn't remember having done it, and therefore he wanted to know who was drawing at his table. And he didn't want to take somebody else's work, so he'd start over again. So these people were always starting things over and over again. Well, she told me that she called the engineering patient in one day and said, I want to give you 3 numbers, and I want you to try very hard to remember what they are. So she gave him 246. And knowing that short-term memory was about 4 to 5 seconds, or this was the emerging hypothesis then, she went out of the room for 5 minutes and came back and said, what's the number? And he said 246. And she was absolutely bowled over. She thought maybe some new thing had happened in his brain. Then she said first a truck went by outdoors and backfired. And they both went to the window to look out to see what it was, to see what the explosion was, and they saw that it was a truck that had backfired. And then she turned to him, she said, well, now what's the number? He said, what number? Well, she found out that you can keep something alive in short-term memory by rehearsing it. Because if you say to yourself, 2, 4, 6, 5 seconds haven't passed, and you can still hear yourself having said it. So the sound comes out of your mouth, goes into your own ear, and you can still remember it for 5 seconds, and then you repeat it again, it'll go in your ear again, and you can remember 2, 4, 6 indefinitely, so long as nobody interrupts you for more than 5 seconds. But if you've been interrupted for more than 5 seconds, then the whole thing is gone, and that's it. So there is a growing body of physiological evidence for some kind of distinction between short-term and long-term memory, And there is some evidence to demonstrate, namely what I've just been explaining to you, that there is a part of the brain that enables it to go from short-term to long-term, and if that is destroyed, then the possibility of long-term memory is forever gone. When we come back from the coffee break, I want to talk a little bit about memory of spiders and insects, and some experiments done on their memories. And of course we know that some things you are born with. For instance, a spider is born with structures in its little tiny brain that enables it to know how to spin a web. And it spins the same kind of web, generally speaking, no matter what the circumstances. Now, you know, the astronauts took a spider up in the up around the moon, and they wanted to know whether or not weightlessness would confuse the spider, and it did. She had a very hard time getting organized to spin the web, and but she finally managed it. And there was a great cheer on the part of the astronauts when, after 16 days, the spider finally got himself reorganized and made a decent-looking web. Because up to that point, it was just all jagged and connected. It was just a very untidy household. And but it was curious that there would be that much adaptability in the spider that finally the spider was able to get rid of weight cues for structuring the web and rely only on tactile or visual cues and structure the web on that basis alone. Very, very extraordinary. But we know that if you hatch a batch of magpies by a light bulb and rear them in isolation, when they go to build the nest, it will look identifiably like a magpie's nest. So that there are structures, there are inborn memories, you might say, of how to do certain things. Man, unlike all other creatures, is born with fewer of those things than almost any other creature. We have few things like how to suck and so on like that, but that's about it. Well, when we come back, I want to explain to you some extraordinary feats of memories on the part of lower creatures, and then I want to review some of these basic points that would enable you to increase the likelihood of children remembering things by virtue of the way you teach them.
Memories of memory.
Mommy.
This is so good. What
Is the
theory that experience is stored in coded form
by the same
same kind of molecule that contains the genetic code, namely deoxyribonucleic acid.
acid of DNA.
Remember,
We're talking about
genes, chromosomes. And since the genes
contain
such terrific information, the blueprint that determines what you're going to be like as a human being. It seemed very likely that human memory would
use the same kind of molecule to code
its experience.
and store.
And you know that every cell,
Whether it's a liver cell,
or a bone cell, a heart cell, or a brain cell, or a skin cell, Each cell
contains
the full blueprint
of who you are.
So,
Given the
extraordinary
capacity to store information
of this
large protein
molecule called DNA, there was a
100 years ago, a major
theory of memory centering around that molecule. It was thought
that
somehow, when experience came to the brain, in some way, it would get coded in a new, by constructing a molecule that would contain that information. About 10 years ago, in 1965, I became very interested in some work at the Abbott Laboratories in North Chicago, who were working on
a learning
enhancing drug called magnesium pemoline. Magnesium pemoline is a white, odorless,
tasteless,
non-toxic powder, which had been developed during the war for its for use with people who had to watch radar screens and would get drowsy because watching a radar screen is so boring. And they